Alright, so hey everyone. Today I want to take a look at the dead zones for Evil West. This is being demonstrated on the Xbox Series X in case it differs on other platforms. But to get into it, for movement, we have a 32.5% rounded square dead zone. And this is created by having an underlying 25% axial dead zone. This creates the square shape, and there's a 10% radial dead zone on top of that, and that creates these rounded corners because it creates the radial dead zone basically in these corners outside of the axial dead zone. But the axial dead zone limits diagonal movement around the axes. So if you're anywhere within these blue regions, you're moving in one of four directions. So in this case, perfectly to the left, perfectly to the right, perfectly forward, and perfectly backward. You only start seeing diagonal movement when you break out of both axis dead zones, represented by the green regions. And this is a little more obvious if we have the cursor up, and you can see that if I'm within this range, I'm pretty well aligned with the edge of that pillar. But if I move into the green region, I start drifting away from it. So for the movement speeds, there are two available with the stick distance. So we have our walk speed and then our run speed. And you can see that this is also a rounded square shape. And so the squarish part is that underlying axial dead zone, and then this is a radial threshold set up on top of it. The walk speed is about 30% of the total run speed. You can see that there's a striped threshold, and there's a lighter shaded striped threshold as well as a more solid one. And what those indicate is the sprint threshold, just different versions of it. So you can see here in this light region, you can't trigger a sprint within this range. If I press the button, nothing happens. But when I'm within this 90-degree region and press the button, I begin sprinting. So you have to be within this 90-degree region to begin a sprint. But once you've started a sprint, the range widens and becomes basically any forward movement. The actual threshold is actually just a hair above the perfect horizontal range, or this axial dead zone. So you can see, and you just saw right there, where I can move just up to that point, and going into the axial dead zone basically return me to a run. You can see the stripe threshold bleeds into the dead zone, and when I move outside of it, I begin moving, and when I move back inside of it, I stop. However, when sprinting, you can see that I can go within the dead zone and still remain sprinting. You have to go within the axial dead zone to actually stop sprinting. So just sort of an interesting quirk, but small enough that it won't really be visible during gameplay. But for the I guess one thing is the sprint speed is about 60% faster than your normal run speed. And take these numbers with a grain of salt. These movement tests aren't super accurate, but it seems to be about 60% faster than your normal run speed. And when you're aiming, you seem to be moving at about 70% of your normal run speed. And at least when aiming, you seem to have the same 2 steps of movement speed available. Where with sprinting, you have just a flat speed that you're moving at once you're sprinting. But moving to the camera, we have same 25% axial dead zone, just without a radial dead zone on top of it. And the same restriction that comes with it. So you can see that I can bob the stick up and down, and the camera is moving perfectly horizontally. And I can even point at near 45-degree angles. But as long as I'm within the axial dead zone, I'm moving perfectly horizontally. You only start seeing diagonal movement once I break out of both axis dead zones. And this is very easy to see when capping the view like this and looking for horizontal movement. The acceleration curve, at least for the general camera, is linear. So it increases linearly up until this shaded region where there's a jump in acceleration. So I'm going to pull back, see it slow down, sped up, and it increases linearly the rest of the way. You can see that this threshold is flat, and the curve here appears to be set up per axis, so that explains why these thresholds are flat. This jump applies vertically, however, the range and sensitivity makes it a little difficult to notice there. But the axial implementation and these flat thresholds make it so that you can see that I'm triggering the acceleration jump here, but when I move diagonally, I can't access it for most of my diagonal movement. You can see my stick can't lean that far diagonally. So this ends up making it so that diagonal movements can feel more sluggish than the cardinal directions because it can't access that acceleration jump. If your stick was able to move further, it could access those acceleration jumps and the full horizontal and vertical movement, which would make the diagonal movement functionally faster. However, generally most sticks can't access that, so in general the diagonals will feel slower because of that. That's exaggerated while aiming. When aiming, it has a different curve, instead sort of an exponential one. However, it doesn't seem scaled to the dead zone. It starts at a speed faster than 0 and then builds up slowly and then faster near the edge of stick input. And it doesn't seem like there's a jump in acceleration. But the axial implementation for the curve seems even more dramatic here, because you can see that these are left and right horizontal movements and vertical movements. But you'd see that the diagonal movements are significantly slower, so perfectly horizontal, diagonal, horizontal, diagonal, vertical, diagonal. And that's because the value you're accessing here is directly the same as the same speed all the way across the vertical axis. and when it actually should be faster if it was set up radially. Again, if your stick could move to the corner of the maximum corner of the square analog range, you would be able to actually get faster diagonals, but because most sticks can't, it's in general going to be slower. And of course, for smaller movements, it's going to be slower across the board. Aside from generally making diagonal movement slower, this also usually affects diagonal movement. It's a little difficult to tell with the axial dead zone already doing that, but it does bias towards the more, or to the closer axis. So that's likely happening, your diagonal movement on top of the axial dead zone, making the diagonals inaccurate. The actual curve implementation is doing that as well. So there are different options for the horizontal and vertical sensitivity, as well as the aiming sensitivity. And actually for the vertical sensitivity, that's different for both the general camera and the aiming camera. So for the vertical camera, it seems that the vertical sensitivity is 50% of the horizontal. So here's the horizontal sensitivity, and here's the vertical. However, when aiming, it seems that the vertical sensitivity is about 70%. Now take all these numbers with a grain of salt too, because testing vertical sensitivity adds a bit of error. So these numbers may not be exact, but they are different. And that usually does affect the diagonal movement as well. It is a little difficult to tell, but so the angles you move, your crosshair is moving when in this general camera mode are functionally different, or would be different from when aiming. So, and that applies both with the axial dead zone, the different curves, and with the different sensitivities. So all those are a little inconsistent because of that. And because the aiming and the general sensitivity are different, you can adjust the vertical and horizontal sensitivities to attempt to make them the same, but you can only get one the same and not the other. This is an issue that was present in Shadow Warrior 1 and 2 with different values, but you could mess with the sensitivities there and get either the hipfire or the zoom sensitivities the same, but not both at the same time. For the aim sensitivity, the default is 1, and when it's at 1, your general sensitivity at max is this, but when you're aiming at a value of 1, your crosshair is about 37% of your general sensitivity. And when you move this all the way down to 0.3, it's about 11% of your general sensitivity. So this is just a general multiplier for the vertical and horizontal sensitivities. So that about covers the controls in Evil West, but there are some assist options. So for combat camera tracking, this is a melee assist. So if an enemy is in front of you, this will automatically track them. So your camera will automatically rotate to follow them to keep that target in front of you. But for the camera aim assist, if we go to aim support, go to assisted, this has a few options. The lock on target, what this does is you have a aim snap that when you pull the trigger and you're close enough to an enemy, it will lock onto the trigger, lock on to the target. And when you lock onto them, if it's on, you'll stay locked onto them in a very hard auto aim kind of lock on, sort of like Grand Theft Auto. When this is off, you'll stay locked on for about a second, but then it will release, and then you'll have to manually aim at that point. The aim snap strength controls how far away from the enemy you can be and still snap onto them. All these values are quite generous, and at the minimum value, you still have to be broadly close to the enemy, but at the maximum 1.5, the enemy can basically be anywhere on screen and you'll snap to them. Aim assist is actually always active, not this snap. However, there is a slowdown that occurs, so your sensitivity will drop when passing over an enemy, and this always occurs even if you have aim support on manual. This is a relatively small amount, but you can't disable that. So that about covers things. This game is an Unreal Engine game, so we can probably blame the 25% axial dead zones on that. That seems to be the engine default, and unless the developers remove it, that's what's going to make it through to the release of the game. And at least with the movement, you can see that they are using radial thresholds for the at least part of the dead zone and the run threshold. So if they set up the dead zones themselves, they might have set up radial ones. However, with the camera curves, we might blame this on Flying Wild Hog because these are set up per axis. And it is pretty unfortunate because Shadow Warrior 2 specifically fixed a diagonal speed issue from the first Shadow Warrior, and actually their games, at least from Hard Reset up through Shadow Warrior 2, used radial dead zones with full diagonal movement, and 2, fixing that diagonal issue from the first Shadow Warrior, had the curve implementation implemented radially, so that specific implementation was good, and they've just stepped back with this, with their games starting to use axial dead zones and curve implementations, at least starting with Shadow Warrior 3. So a little unfortunate backstep on that, but this game doesn't really need that much precision, but it is unfortunate when they've had a higher standard in the past. But that about covers it. So thanks for watching, and everyone, have a great rest of your day.